Hello Internet, I'm Jackie Fox, and in our last 3 videos we've talked about zombie companies and possibly how to steer ourselves away from a zombie economic system and how neoliberalism is coming to an end, but we still have the problem of a lot of these companies being too big to fail. And then you have possibly the biggest zombie of them all, Evergrande in China. And I haven't seen any, I think, American sources, especially on YouTube, talking about what's happened to Evergrande basically in like the last 6 or 8 months. There's a little bit of, there are news sources that I have. A lot of them are a little bit more to the right, but there aren't a lot of people talking about what China has done with Evergrande, and I think that it has the potential to be really instructive about how we could handle too big to fail companies without creating a zombie stock market. So let's get into that. I promised to talk about Evergrande, and I ended my last video with a mention of state capitalism. So how did China respond to their equivalent to the Lehman Brothers crisis with Evergrande? Well, completely fucking differently for starters. I don't find myself liking or agreeing with China's decisions internally or externally, but I do think their response to this type of crisis is illustrative of how we could have avoided this entire zombie economic apocalypse to begin with. But first, a little history. China has undergone a massive migration from the countryside into the cities, where the Chinese middle class are aided in purchasing apartments. Many have found this newfound ability to buy property as a valid means of growing the Chinese middle class. And so, many Chinese own multiple apartments. There is an influx of millions, and more people own empty apartments in addition to the one that housed them. And someone has to build all of those extra apartments. Enter Evergrande, a relatively new developer that, like all zombie companies, subsists off of easy loans instead of profits, although they do make quite a bit of money. These are the trends that lead to the rise of the infamous ghost cities in China, which both represent a speculative property boom as well as a tremendous and often cheaply constructed source of busy work for the general Chinese GDP, which is nearly 1/3 real estate, double the ratio of countries like the US and the UK. But Evergrande is more than just a development company. They're also key investors as well as a key investment in the Chinese markets. You could say, in a way, they are the Chinese markets, or at least a very big portion of them. And the scale of their influence, and more importantly integration into the current Chinese economy, is staggering, even compared to the companies we've talked about before, with the exception of maybe companies like BlackRock. And the result of this just one company, and this is the whole 2008 crisis on an even larger scale, and the results of just this one company and its holdings and subsidiaries. Naturally, the Western press almost gleefully jumped on this opportunity to report in the Financial Times speculated to be China's Lehman moment, a reference to the first bank to fall in the US housing crisis as recently as March of 2022. And the situation was dire. Among other direct effects of Evergrande no longer being able to secure funding that they needed to keep going, you should understand that they were taking money from basically anyone who would hand it to them. Investors, government, and prospective homebuyers. And from the perspective of that last group of middle-class families trying to invest in their future, this looked a lot like a Ponzi scheme. They paid a low price to get a great investment that was built to order. This created a delay often seen in such schemes that allowed it to operate. The money coming in would build new houses. but it was used to keep up with their earlier commitments, relying on new loans or new purchases to pay for things that they had just promised to build. So, when the money stopped flowing, hundreds of thousands of middle-class Chinese were left holding the bag.
As Evergrande's debt crisis deepens, small business owners and people waiting for homes to be completed are starting to despair.
These investors were lured in with various promises.
Really, they're going to have a problem on their hands if all those people end up without homes, savings, and little left to lose, along with basically everyone else in the market. But when you're talking about who is holding the largest portion of the bag, you're mainly talking about foreign investors who saw the booming Chinese real estate market that had just drooled all over themselves to get in on. At this time, Evergrande was looking at an average annual growth of 44%, which is a number that even many of the recent crypto-based US Ponzi schemes have failed to even come close to promising. So to many investors, this looks like the best investment in the world. Literally, in the world. Or at least until 2020. Fearing exactly the same type of crisis, China implemented a policy known as 3 red lines, meant to limit a company's debt. Those who crossed those lines wouldn't have access to state credit, and Evergrande was a poster child for crossing them all. So, in addition, China slowed the issuance of mortgage loans to the public, which cut them off from prospective homeowners who were relying on a cheap interest rate for mortgages, while at the same time demand and countryside migration is actually down right now as the markets become less affordable. So for the last 2 years, American pundits have suggested that this would tip over the entirety of the Chinese economy if China didn't bail this company out. And seemingly, by their own rules, the 3 red lines, they couldn't extend them credit. Would they take this seriously, or would they bend the rules for this big company? Would they employ the too big to fail philosophy that the West always had? Many Western viewers got stuck in this false binary of total collapse or buyout, because they wrongly believed that these were the only 2 things that could possibly happen, because of our own past experiences in the previous decade. So what happened? Well, despite this mess starting in 2020, it took until late 2021 for Evergrande to start defaulting on its debts to investors, causing turmoil locally and abroad. This was a big dynamic shift, as many investors had anticipated a big bailout that never came. They had expected Evergrande, if any company ever, would be too big to fail, and that would make them able to walk away with a massive payday still. But defaulting on their debts was just a big wake-up call. And it's one that deeply cut outside investment into Chinese real estate, which just seems like it would be making things worse. And yet, the Chinese economy hasn't collapsed. And Evergrande is being allowed to kind of go through a managed failure. The Chinese government's response to Evergrande's failures to pay their own bonds in late 2021 was to break apart and nationalize parts of the company by reverting its property and land usage rights back to local governments and carving up the company into many smaller pieces. This is less of a bailout and more of a managed collapse. And at least so far, it's going pretty well. And to be honest, there is still room for this to fail. This is something to keep your eye on, for sure. But for right now, it seems like the managed failure type situation that we're seeing here is a perfectly economically valid alternative to the too big to fail mindset. Another thing that should be a big takeaway from this and the different responses to the 2008 and 2020 crisis is that it's important to bail out from the bottom up in times of crisis. The years following 2008 left a lot of Americans and younger generations completely in the lurch. And while COVID wasn't exactly an ideal reaction to a crisis, the help that we did give the general public was a welcome safety net. Even if it did nothing to change growing issues like rising rents, while the top-down bailout was simultaneously making this issue worse through companies like BlackRock and Blackstone. But the government proved that working class need not just grin and bear it. The Fed is forecasting higher unemployment from all the measures that they're using to try to curb inflation, raising the catastrophically low interest rates that have made all of this bullshit possible. And while that may be in some way necessary, what has been proven unnecessary is simply letting unemployed workers fail.
As Evergrande's debt crisis deepens, small business owners and people waiting for homes to be completed are starting to despair.
These investors were lured in with various promises.
And all of that was good and true in June. But in this part of the video, I'm going to start talking about the things that happened in July. So, is this a big deal? Absolutely. Will it be the collapse of Chinese socialism? Probably not. But, as I was writing this last installment of this series, a lot of things came to a head in China. And ultimately, a lot of their banking system, if not their entire housing market, currently hangs in the balance. It's not entirely because of Evergrande or how they responded to it. And in some ways, it's actually kind of based. We're talking mortgage strikes and sticking it to the big banks. Real David and Goliath story. And there's a reason why I started the earlier version of this video, written for the most part in early July, as some of these things were still fresh and unreported in the Western media. I don't find myself liking or agreeing with China's decisions internally or externally. There are two big and mostly separate stories here, happening at the same time and with similar overall effects. So let's talk about the Chinese banking crisis. This is not entirely the fault of the housing market, but the housing market is a significant portion of this, and on a scale that has a significantly larger footprint than the housing crisis of 2008. While calling the fall of Evergrande China's Lehman Brothers moment was a bit premature earlier, this current crisis that the Chinese government faces in the way of mortgage strikes could play out, could actually be their gigantomaxed Lehman Brothers moment. One of the first problems that's being unveiled in the July 2022 banking crisis is that a number of banks' employees were rerouting customers' money from secure savings into unsecured investments because these employees were taking a kickback from those companies and leading the customers to believe that they were just going into regular savings accounts that would be insured by the government.
As authorities were made aware of these risky practices, they were quick to charge 2 executives with fraud. Authorities were able to arrest one executive, but the chairman of the company has since fled the country and is suspected that he has made his way into the United States. With him are gone the $6 billion that customers had deposited into the bank. This is where the true headache for the authorities began. They can't return the money, even if they wanted to. This wasn't some Bernie Madoff type scheme. This was way worse than that. In the case of Madoff, the government was able to recover most of the principal amounts that victims had deposited. But in China's case, there's nothing left to recover.
And this what caused a lot of people to try to pull their money out in a run on that particular bank. But runs on the banks are just a little bit irrational and a little bit contagious. Because the more you actually think about the way that fractional reserve banking works, the more uneasy you typically get. So this type of corruption only sets the stage for what's really coming in July. We see customers of the banks trying to get the government to cover the money that they believe they were putting into savings, but the government so far refuses to do so because the money was in fact put into investments without their knowledge. Now, to my knowledge, this remains unresolved, and it's leading to continued protests, especially in the province where it was first uncovered. But there's a much bigger factor here. Remember earlier when I said that people were investing into buying apartments in advance? And that buildings were yet to be constructed, and when Evergrande started to get in trouble, this left hundreds of thousands of Chinese homeowners, or at least potential homeowners, in the lurch? Well, it seems like since the implementation of the 3 red lines, Evergrande hasn't put much money into its ongoing construction projects. And some of these projects were offered to their customers as far back as 2019. Meanwhile, the banks that provided the loans to purchase these pieces of property that right now look as though they will not be constructed, and in fact a lot of ongoing construction is being demolished at this very moment, and a lot of entire ghost cities are just falling into their own footprint as we speak. And as this begins to happen around them, all these people begin to organize. First, and early in July, it's just one group of people saying they will no longer pay back their mortgages until construction begins on what they were promised. Because otherwise, they're not paying a mortgage for a property that it does not look like will ever exist. And I don't know about you, but I wouldn't be willing to pay for that either. And then, after large protests and a lot of promotion over social media, this caught on. And within a few days, a number of groups came together and demanded that construction continue before they repaid their loans. This affected many, if not all, of the banks pretty rapidly. And as large numbers of people begin to default or threaten to default on their loans, all of the same type of investments relying on a strong housing market begin to crumble in an economy in which the housing market is 3 times as large of the proportion of the GDP of a country like America. This is an even more massive threat to China. And this spontaneously organized movement is spreading like wildfire across the mainland. And when you combine these two stories and the widespread uncertainty about the banks, it becomes more and more likely that we will see a run on the banks at a large scale, as some financial institutions are already beginning to limit the amount of money that people can withdraw. It's also worth pointing out that Evergrande tends to be the company that everyone focuses the blame on in this story. There are actually a number of other Chinese developers that had practically the same business model, and some that even had similar scale to Evergrande. And many of these companies were interdependent on each other and through cross-investment. And so when one of them began to fall and show instability, it hurt all the others in that network as well. As well as this instability in the market is scaring foreign investors a bit across the board. Even though I think that the way that China is handling Evergrande in particular here is for the most part they're doing the right thing in the way they're handling that, with the exception of one thing. Dangling that promise of home ownership over all of these people's heads for the last 2 years while assuring them nothing. And despite saying earlier that China was resolving this crisis without a major bailout, now, as of the end of July, China is sending over $1 trillion of liquidity to major developers on the condition that they use that money to continue construction, so that people will begin to pay back their loans. Now, I still think that with a bailout like this, it needs to come from a state buying a stake in a company, so it's not just a bailout, it's a business arrangement, it's a purchase, it's a buyout in some cases. And well, they're kind of doing that with some of these companies in the way that they're managing and demonopolizing them. And it seems like this isn't a condition of the bailout. And maybe I'd like it a little bit better if it was. But ultimately, this is giving those people what they deserve, which is what they paid for, and what they have continued to pay for years of uncertainty. The fact that they haven't done something like this until now should show you something about their determination to the dream of home ownership. But now they're pissed, and they're organizing mortgage strikes. But it should also be a powerful reminder to governments, even strong authoritarian governments, of what the people can do when they finally decide to come together over an important issue. Because even if it is hard to get started, a revolution spreads like wildfire by word of mouth when it solves a crisis the people face. And this movement gives the people so much incredible leverage, the ability to crash the entire Chinese economy if they don't get their way. And ultimately, this $1 trillion bailout kind of seems like it's for them. Now, I know what you might be thinking. This isn't, like I was suggesting before, a bailout from the ground up. Because by the nature of this, most of these people are buying, like, second homes. They're good. They're not, like, working class people who are struggling to afford rent. They're buying, investment properties. Some people are buying their first homes this way. But a lot of this is just investment property. My point being that this is mainly a very middle class issue. This is bailing from the middle, which is better than, letting whatever carrion trickle down that is left when they bail out the top. But it's also not quite bailing out the bottom. What would be bailing out the bottom is all those people who had their savings defrauded from them. The government stepping up and saying, well, because of this fraud, you thought it was insured, so in this case, we're going to honor that. And we're also going to penalize the hell out of everyone who ripped you off. That would be a real from the bottom type bailout. But this is more of a bailout from the middle. But that being said, it doesn't seem like a bailout that's intended to let the companies that warranted it get away with murder in the way that we've generally seen before. I could be looking at this overly optimistically. A lot of the money may just disappear due to corruption. But at least on paper, the idea of China giving these companies money and saying, let's give the people what they paid for, is a great way to solve this whole problem. And while it might take a while for some of that construction to get started, and what happens in the meantime? When will the people decide that this is enough and start repaying their loans? And could the people who were defrauded by their banks outside of the real estate market use this as an example and as a way to get government relief themselves? In the time when it feels like big governments and corporations wield so much power over us that it's just heartening to hear a story in which people come together in protest and with a mortgage strike, an effective means of resistance, coordinate this mortgage strike that has the power to absolutely cripple such an enormous nation. Because as the globalization and neoliberalization of the world begins to falter, this could be one of the first signs of the people saying, we'll fix this ourselves if we have to. So, if you enjoy thinking about the future that lies beyond our current hellscape, if you would like to imagine that future in my comments, I would greatly appreciate it. I'd love to hear, what kind of future you think could rise from the ashes of all of this. Especially because I really believe that us imagining that future together is greatly important to us ever reaching it. You've got to know where you're going to get there, for the most part. You generally don't stumble into the place that you were supposed to be. So, thank you for watching, and if you appreciated this content, I'm going to be putting some links on the screen where you can donate and help support this channel. But even if you don't, you can drop a like, you can subscribe, you can do all of those cool things. Thank you. And I'll see you next time.